Hi, folks. This is the second part of our sort of a walk through the memo assignment to kind of give you an idea. And we're just going to be looking at the spreadsheet. We're going to, as I said, we're going to be giving you a template here, the United States. You can see this is the case study here is the United States. You'll be doing something similar for China. Now, the thing is, we're going to be starting, really, it's very simple in terms of what data we're going to be giving you. We're going to be starting you off with just three variables, and we'll be supplying you with this data: money, nominal GDP, and real GDP. Okay, and you can see that we're going through here. Now, this is a little bit dated. You'll be doing in the sense that we were doing this as if we were in 2010 and we'd be looking forward 2011, 12 through 2020. Fortunately, you guys are going to be going through some past year all the way up through 2017, and then that will be your historical exercise, and then you will be and then you will be applying this to a forward looking exercise beginning in 2018 and going through 2028. So that's a key difference there. So anyway, so we'll be giving you these data, and then you have basically, first of all, your first task is going to be to calculate, and the first three variables are just growth rates, and I'm going to show you, we go to show formulas here, and you can see that all we're doing here is we're taking the growth rate of G over here, that's this over that minus 1, the same thing for nominal GDP growth, and then the same thing for real GDP growth. There you go. Okay, so that shows you very clearly. Now the price level then, okay, all we're doing here is that we're calculating the GDP deflator. We're using the convention. We're multiplying it by 100, and we're taking nominal over real. So you already learned that that is the GDP deflator. Okay, and then our measure of inflation, of course, is the growth rate of that. Then the measure of velocity, of course, is going to be nominal GDP over money. You've learned that already. So here we're forecasting it, and then we're getting the growth rate of velocity here. Okay, we're doing that here, and this is our historical analysis. It's often very helpful to group things into sort of the data into sort of clumps of time. And for the United States, it was actually very convenient to do this just by decade. And why is that? Because we saw that that actually inflation has changed over decades. Now we'll give you something similar to this, and you feel free to change the years if you think that we have clumped together the years in an inappropriate way, and you could do a better job for China. But in any event, okay, here we have the average, for example, the average growth of inflation here, growth of price level, the inflation. And you can see that as we move through these decades, okay, we can see inflation was pretty low during the 60s. It bumped up considerably during the 70s, and actually started coming back down during the 80s, and receding during the 90s. You can see here that we have also the blue bar is prices, the gray bar is money, and you can see that money is going up with prices. So you can see that yes, you're going to have this correspondence here between money growth and price growth. Okay, so in that sort of bears out one of the main lessons of the quantity theory, is more money growth, more price growth. But that's not the end of the story. We can see, for example, that if we want to look at the growth of real GDP, that was actually much higher during the 60s than it was in recent years. But on the other hand, you can see that velocity. Now, as we mentioned before, velocity is also a determinant of inflation, giving everything else constant. And you can see that velocity was growing, and it was growing especially in both in the 60s and the 70s. And there's some reasons for that. And then it was kind of coming back down. Now, why is this? Now, okay, so we may get a clue here from the United States. You can see that inflation was going up and up and up and up and up and up, and then what happened was that we had a sort of a failed attempt first time around to bring inflation down, and then ultimately that happened, and inflation started coming down during the 80s. And then you can see here, yes, money growth higher, but interestingly, okay, throughout the 60s and the 70s, we see velocity rising. Now, why is it? Now, there's two reasons. Two potential reasons. Okay, one is that you had higher inflation, so people were interested in protecting their wealth, protecting their money, their purchasing power, which means that they would want to store their wealth in some other form other than money, which was being taxed by the government by this inflation, reducing their purchasing power. On top of that, as I discussed in the previous video, this was the time, especially during the late 70s and early 80s, mid 70s, I would say even, that when automatic teller machines, for example, were being introduced, and more broadly, just a lot of financial innovation that made it easier for people to transform their wealth from one form, let's say a savings account, or let's say a time deposit, or even equities, into cash that we use. So the idea here is that they had the technology to economize on money balances to protect themselves against this higher inflation, and at the same time the inflation rate itself was going higher and higher, and you can see that happening here. Okay, but then you can see that as inflation came down, so did monetary velocity. People became a little bit more comfortable with holding even more money in their pockets, as they could be confident that the central bank was managing money, the printing of money, with a little bit more credibility. So once again, you can see here that this was the equation of exchange at work, showing us that in different periods, different rates of inflation. Broadly speaking, yes, when you print more money, you will get higher prices, higher price growth, higher inflation, but also other variables, including velocity, were telling the story there. Now, looking forward, we're going to be giving you some assumptions here. So, for example, we could give you an assumption on the real growth rate of your economy, and also what velocity will be, okay, going forward. And in this case, we have forecasted a sort of a constant velocity. The velocity had fallen, but it's not going to fall anymore. And I want to mention something else here. Okay, when we look at velocity, you can see that also that there was a huge that actually, if we focus on this last period, it turns out that inflation was rising during this period. Oil prices were rising. This was the run up to what they call the Great Financial Crisis. But when things got really scary, that's when cash became king. Boom! You could see that people shifted out of equities and into money, and that meant a reduction in velocity. But in any event, going forward, we were predicting at the time that velocity would then be constant, and we were also predicting that growth would be about 3%. Now you can ask whether that's a good assumption or not, and we're also predicting money growth, okay, as to be fairly stable here at a little bit more, at 4.3%, and that will give us sort of a consistent view going forward of how money, inflation, prices, and output sort of hang together using the equation of exchange. Okay, so once again, we've walked you through our spreadsheet for the United States, but we're going to be asking you to do the same thing for China, and coming up with a nice story, an explanation, a narrative, as it will, in terms of as it were, in terms of what had been happening in China. And we want you to use any of the materials that we've supplied you, and then going forward, as I said, we'll be doing from 2018 to 2028. We'll want a kind of a forward-looking story, what's going to happen to inflation in China. Okay, thank you very much.